In 1981, Pope John Paul II wrote an apostolic exhortation on the role of the Christian family in the modern world. In this document, the Holy Father wrote, "The Christian family constitutes a specific revelation and realization of communion. And for this reason, the family can and should be called a domestic church. As the church is a community of faith, hope, and love, so the Christian family, as the domestic church, is called to be a community of faith, hope, and love." Today we celebrate the feast of the Holy Family of Nazareth, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And while they were the Holy Family, it's important to keep in mind that they were not the perfect family. They were not a family without struggles or hardships. If you'll recall in Scripture, at one point, Mary and Joseph actually lose track of their son for 3 days before finding him teaching and preaching in the temple. Now, many of you here are parents. Can you imagine just how traumatic, just how sickening it must have been for Mary and Joseph not to know the whereabouts of their son for 3 days? While Scripture doesn't give us an account of Joseph's death, we can conclude that Mary and Jesus endured the loss, endured the sadness of Joseph dying. And then later on, when Jesus entered into his own passion and death, Mary was left to stand by her son without the benefit of her husband, Joseph. And so the Holy Family had more than their fair share of heartache and heartbreak. But in the midst of the struggles that they would have to endure, they remained holy, and they sanctified the Christian family. And this sanctification was accomplished by the ordinary ways in which they lived their lives. Mary and Joseph taught their son how to walk, how to talk, how to pray. Mary would have read Scripture to her son and taught him the Psalms. She would have told her son stories. She would have prepared meals for him, cared for him when he was sick, tucked him into bed. And it was from Joseph that Jesus learned the trade of carpentry, which would eventually be his own way of making a living when he would become an adult. In our gospel today, we see Mary and Joseph fulfilling the Jewish custom by taking Jesus to the temple to offer sacrifice. And there's a detail from this passage that gives us some insight into this family. Luke tells us that the family offered a pair of turtle doves in accordance with the law. Now, you have to understand that the usual offering would have been 1 turtle dove and 1 lamb. But the Jewish law would allow for a modification of 2 turtle doves for families who were too poor to afford a lamb for the sacrifice. And so this gives us some insight into the Holy Family's level of material poverty. They were poor, dirt poor. And so Jesus Christ, the creator of the universe, not only chose to become human, but he chose to be born into a humble, lower-class family who most likely had to struggle to make ends meet. Mary, Queen of the universe, lived her life as a wife and a mother with very little extras, if any at all. Saint Joseph, the universal patriarch of the church, worked very hard for little pay. They probably had to keep track of every dollar that they made, and yet they were the richest family in the world because they had one another. They were rich because they were holy, and they were holy because they personified what a Christian family looks like. They were a model of faith, hope, and love. The ingredients of the Christian family highlighted by Pope John Paul II in his letter. Joseph and Mary were a married couple dedicated to one another, faithful to one another, loving toward one another and their son. At its core, this is what a vocation to marriage and family life is all about. It is self-gift. It is a spouse giving the gift of him or herself for the good of the other spouse. It is willing the good of the other for the sake of the other without any intention for personal gain. This is what true spousal love is all about. And as a married couple, Mary and Joseph lived this out beautifully in the midst of their humble and simple home life. And so a lesson that we can learn from the Holy Family is that authentic richness, the authentic richness of a family, is not in the family's material wealth. It's not in the size of their home. It's not in their bank account or the size of their investment portfolio. But the true wealth of a family is measured by their faith, hope, and love of one another and of God, the domestic church.